Welcome back to another edition. I've been going down a rabbit hole today thinking of Ebenezer Scrooge. And I've had this idea for some time um, about really fleshing out and exploring Scrooge's childhood and putting that in the terms that we know today as far as emotional wounding and trauma, how that was showing up in his life, how that really created the man that he became and was so famously portrayed by Dickens, and more specifically applying internal family systems to his story, um, and following the progression of his liberation and transformation from that lens. So I think probably a lot of you know that I co-authored a book called The Financial Wisdom of Ebenezer Scrooge, where we dissected his life as it related to money and all of his money scripts, Cratchit's money scripts, and really took a very unique look at that story. And from that story came a method of treatment, so to speak, a methodology of helping people get a handle and transcend their money behaviors, which the process was some type of an intervention, which was Marley coming to visit Scrooge. And then the progression of the guides, the ghosts, and how they took him first into his past, then into the present, and finally into the future, and in that order. And from all of that, he was able to completely transform his life. And we have found that this is a progression that works really well with anybody when it comes to transforming money behaviors. So let's develop this just a little bit. Let's take a look at Scrooge, the child. I mean, he's just not merely a grumpy old miser. He's a man whose internal family systems, his internal financial system, is dominated by protective parts of him that are just working overtime to shield deeply wounded parts of him. In IFS, we call these exiles. And the protective parts could be coping strategies, ego personas. There's a lot of different names you could apply to these, but I'll apply it IFS. His outward behaviors, where it was obsessive frugality, a lot of emotional detachment, a real disdain for human connection. And these are all evidence of a real internal struggle, which we know today are shaped by past traumas and fears, which resulted in deeply ingrained beliefs and money scripts when we look at the financial aspect. I mean, Dickens described him as he was a tight-fisted hand at the grindstone. Scrooge, a squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner. He goes on to describe him in almost elemental terms, as if he was part of the harsh winter himself. He says he was hard and sharp as flint, from which no steel had ever struck out generous fire. Secret and self-contained and solitary as an oyster. You think about it, there's not too many things more solitary than an oyster. Yet another line, the cold within him froze his old features, nipped his pointed nose, shriveled his cheek, stiffened his gait, made his eyes red, his lips thin blue, and spoke out shrewdly in his grating voice. No warmth could warm, no wintry weather could chill him, no wind that blew was bitterer than he, no falling snow was more intent upon its purpose, and no pelting rain less open to entreaty. Wow. So that's somebody that's more than just miserly. I mean, we're describing here somebody who is emotionally frozen, joyless, almost pathologically isolated. I mean, those are almost inhumane terms in which Dickens describes him, just untouchable. So I thought what would be interesting would be kind of a side-by-side comparison between Dickens' description and an IFS-informed psychological breakdown of him. For example, in IFS terms, his manager parts are really rigid and controlling. They manifest as hyper-vigilant protectors, enforcing discipline, order, self-denial. And these parts believe that emotional openness or generosity would invite vulnerability, and that the only path to safety is through control and isolation. They enforce beliefs like money is security and dependence is dangerous. Super self-preservation. Those were his manager parts. His firefighter parts could occasionally show up as dismissive sarcasm or explosive rejections of warmth. You know, his famous cry, bah humbug. These parts really reacted defensively when Scrooge is confronted with any emotion or connection. They just work to extinguish any emotional fires sparked by those exiles, by those unhealed wounds. And then we have the exiles, which were likely, like most exiles, very young, neglected, or shamed parts. We can see that they held burdens of abandonment, grief, worthlessness, and were probably formed in his childhood when he experienced emotional neglect, perhaps at the boarding school or in the family that equated love with performance or financial success. So psychologically, when we look at it through like a DSM-5 lens, Scrooge exemplifies what psychologists would call a hoarder. So that would be a money script that's really rooted in scarcity, shaped by his unresolved trauma. So despite his wealth, he operates from a place of poverty, emotionally, relationally. He's really a classic example, someone who appears successful by external standards, but who was super suffering from profound internal dysregulation. So I think what makes his arc so powerful is that it's not merely a story of external redemption, which I have said a lot. It's an internal reorganization. Over the course of the story, his self, that energy that IFS theory would say all of us have, that cannot be damaged, that contains the characteristics, the qualities of compassionate, calm, and connectedness, is gradually unblended from those super strong, harsh protectors. Somebody asked me recently if somebody who's almost psychopathic could be helped by IFS. And the answer is yes. And I think Scrooge being an example of such a person. And it was with the help of the spirits who served as skilled external guides or therapists, if you will, that he really reconnects with these exiled parts. He witnesses the protectors. He witnesses the exile's pain and begins that process of healing. And by the end, his system is more balanced and his parts are less extreme. And he is a self-led person at the end. So what is important here is to take a look at Scrooge as a boy, because like everybody, before he was this unbelievable extreme personality, this extreme miser, he was a boy. He was a baby at one time. And as we piece together and do some research on his childhood, he was one that was left alone too often, too long, too few options for safety or connection. If we look at his childhood through the lens of internal family systems, we can see that his adult behaviors around money made perfect sense. They weren't born out of greed or cruelty, and that's something that I once thought. You know, when you think of Scrooge, you think of somebody who's greedy, who's cruel. But when we take a deeper look, he was born out of a complex system built to survive emotional injuries. And those injuries, those wounded times, became internal rules, which became his money scripts. So every internal system, every internal financial system has its own story. For Scrooge, it started out in a cold boarding school during the holidays, at least in the story, when we can see that. Certainly it started earlier than that. But in this case, at the boarding school, which was typical during these times, the other children went home. But he stayed behind over and over again. Now that's not just sad, it's super formative to the man that he became. And the moment really becomes a frozen in time exile, a young part of Scrooge's system that was burdened with many beliefs. And one belief that could come out of this is, I don't matter enough to be remembered. I don't matter enough to be transported home. I mean, that's huge. That in itself is huge. It's not just loneliness. It's a profound sense of emotional scarcity. There's no warmth in going home. There's no consistent caregiver in his life. There's no felt sense of being wanted by a parent or parents. So that young part of him, maybe we'd name him the boarding school boy, got exiled, tucked away in the internal system so the rest of the system could continue to go, and covered up, exiled by protectors. So IFS would teach us that these exiles carry the burdens of past trauma, shame, fear, despair, and they become stuck in that moment, in those scenes where the wounding occurred. So in his case, these burdens, which, like I said, one is I don't matter enough to be remembered, can also be I can't depend on people. I can't depend on anyone to be there for me. I'm only safe when I have control. And there's no one coming to save me. So those beliefs, those burdens, as IFS would call them, really shape behaviors. And once an exile is formed, the system adapts. It maneuvers around that exile. And in IFS terms, the manager parts step in to prevent that wound from ever being triggered again. So his managers are strict. They're strategic, like all managers. And they're constantly scanning the horizon, the setting for risks. The motto of a manager, and I think this applies to almost every manager, is never again. Never again. So with Scrooge, if he was in today's world, he would be a perfectionist who would trust spreadsheets more than people. Back then, of course, they didn't have spreadsheets, but they did have accounting and a lot of black ink. He had a minimalist protector who kept the fire low and the house colder than necessary. He had a hyper-vigilant budgeter who hoards again, but not out of greed. Scrooge's parts hoarded out of terror. So these are all money scripts, which, if you've listened to me for any period of time, money scripts are unconscious beliefs that shape our financial choices. And they form when we are very young and operate like gospel, like this is certain truths. And for example, Scrooge's money scripts could be, in the book we came up with 39, and that was just a drop in the bucket. For example, if I give, I'll go without. People want me only for my money. Security is having more than I need and still not feeling safe. This is just a drop in the bucket of money scripts that we see playing out in his story. So what's important to understand here is that these scripts are a trauma response. They are not inherently rational or irrational. We do know they're rational and that they make perfect sense when we understand how they formed. So these manuscripts are adaptations, and they work. They worked for especially young Scrooge, but they work until they don't, and they work until the play changes. Hence the reference of being a script. Now, sometimes the exile does get triggered anyway, and in spite of the manager's best efforts. Maybe someone extends an invitation like Fred did when he asked Scrooge to Christmas dinner. Now, Fred was his nephew, who was the son of Fran, his sister, who died young and was probably the only caring person in his life. And that invitation triggers an old wound. You weren't wanted before. Why would this time be different? And suddenly the system panics. Or it can trigger an old wound of unresolved grief around Fran's early death. Whatever that trigger is, that's when the firefighter parts jump in. They're reactive, impulsive. They're designed to numb the pain. So for some people, this looks like overspending. For Scrooge, it looked like shutting down, lashing out, or ridiculing others. His sarcasm toward Fred isn't indifference, it's defensive. It is kind of a classic firefighter belief that if I burn the bridge, no one can leave me. So firefighters are often misunderstood. In IFS, they make perfect sense. They're soothers. Firefighters have the best intentions. They want to soothe. And in this case, they wanted to shut down the invitation from Fred before it went any further. And that exile could be continued to be poked. They're trying to put out the fire. Unfortunately, though, many times they often torch the house to do it. Another thing that is apparent in this story are legacy burdens. IFS also teaches us that we carry legacy burdens. Those are unresolved emotional patterns inherited from family or our culture. And Scrooge likely inherited beliefs from a father who was emotionally unavailable, financially anxious, or both. It's not hard to imagine that he passed down messages like money's power, emotion is weakness, discipline matters more than connection, you earn your worth. There could be many more as I continue to dig into this. But these legacy burdens get embedded early and passed down, and they're just unchallenged by the child. And so by the time Scrooge becomes an adult, the system is running on autopilot. The exiles are buried. The managers are in charge. The firefighters are on standby. And the self, that compassionate, calm, caring center, is barely audible, is hardly seen. So all this shows up in his financial behaviors: dipping candles, refusing charity, hoarding cash, mirroring the internal systems architecture of Scrooge. Every dollar saved is a manager's attempt at control. Every rejection of a relationship is a firefighter's attempt to preempt abandonment. I don't want to get close, don't want to get close, don't want to get connected because I'll be abandoned. Every sarcastic comment is a defense against emotional exposure. I'm not going to get close because I don't want to expose myself. There is pain there. If we saw these in a person today, we might observe obsessive tracking of expenses or refusal to retire, right? Despite having wealth. Conflicts in relationships around generosity or spending. A deep guilt or anxiety about doing it wrong with money. We might hear financial money scripts like, there's never enough. If I stop working, I'll disappear. I can either be safe or connected, but not both. So the genius of Dickens, whether consciously or not, is that he walks through Scrooge through a therapeutic arc. The ghost of Christmas past takes him straight to the exiles. The ghost of Christmas present reveals the consequences of his protectors running unchecked. And the ghost of Christmas future shows him the cost of never healing, the lonely grave, the legacy of fear. And somewhere in this process, Scrooge self wakes up. The protectors start to be willing to step back as Scrooge witnesses them, as he begins to bring compassion to his system. And a blending starts. The self doesn't push the parts away. It turns toward them. It listens as the parts, the protectors, begin to step back. And that's when transformation begins. Scrooge's story isn't just about redemption. It's about understanding the architecture of a traumatized internal financial system and how that system shapes financial behavior. Till we recognize the roles our parts are playing, we'll keep repeating the same patterns. We'll think it's about money, but it's not. It's about protection. It's about never again. So IFS teaches us that every part has a positive intention, even if its methods are extreme. Scrooge's parts weren't evil. Scrooge's parts were not evil. They were terrified. They did the best they could with the tools that they had. They were all young. The exiles were young. The protectors were young. And when they were given a chance to be witnessed by self-energy, they were willing to change. So that's the invitation of this story and of IFS-informed financial therapy, to see behind the behavior, to honor the system, and to gently lead it toward healing with compassion and self-energy. Thanks for listening.